Have you ever wondered why someone can look you straight in the eye, promise they'll change, swear they'll be different this time, and then nothing? The planning fallacy explains why avoidants promise change but never deliver, and understanding this psychological trap might just save your sanity. Picture this scenario. Someone who's been emotionally distant for months suddenly realizes they're about to lose you. In that moment of panic, they genuinely believe they can transform overnight. They'll attend therapy. They'll communicate better. They'll be the partner you've always needed. The promises flow like water, each one more convincing than the last. But here's what makes this phenomenon so maddening. They actually believe their own promises when they make them. The planning fallacy is a cognitive bias where people consistently underestimate how long tasks will take and overestimate their ability to complete them. When applied to relationships, it becomes a cruel dance of hope and disappointment. Avoidant individuals, already wired to minimize emotional complexity, fall into this trap more deeply than most. They see changing ingrained patterns of behavior as simple as flipping a switch, when in reality, it's more like rewiring an entire electrical system. What makes this particularly devastating is that these aren't necessarily manipulative lies. The person making these promises often experiences what psychologists call projection bias. They assume their current motivated state will persist indefinitely. In that moment of potential loss, when their attachment system finally activates, they feel capable of anything. The problem is that feelings fade, motivation wanes, and old patterns reassert themselves with surprising force. This creates a vicious cycle that relationship experts call the promise relapse pattern. Each failed attempt at change doesn't just disappoint the partner. It actually reinforces the avoidant person's unconscious belief that they're fundamentally flawed and incapable of sustaining intimate connections. It's like watching someone try to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom, wondering why the water keeps disappearing. Understanding this dynamic requires looking beyond surface behavior to the deeper psychological mechanisms at play. The optimism bias compounds the planning fallacy, making people believe they're somehow different from everyone else who has struggled with similar changes. They think their willpower is stronger, their circumstances more favorable, their motivation more pure. But the human brain doesn't operate on willpower alone. It runs on systems, habits, and deeply embedded neural pathways that resist change with remarkable persistence. If you want to better understand someone's attachment style, see the link in the description to one of the most popular books on attachment theory. Consider the story of someone we'll call Marcus, whose pattern of promising change had become as predictable as clockwork. Every few months, when his partner Rachel reached her breaking point, Marcus would experience what felt like an epiphany. He'd see clearly how his emotional withdrawal was damaging their relationship, and in those moments of clarity, transformation seemed not just possible, but inevitable. The first time it happened, Marcus promised Rachel he would share his feelings more openly. He genuinely believed this was a simple matter of choosing different words during conversations. Like Joe Goldberg from the Netflix series You, Marcus had an uncanny ability to convince himself of his own narratives. The difference was that Marcus was lying to himself, not others. For 3 days, Marcus made a conscious effort to express his emotions. He told Rachel about his day with more detail, shared a childhood memory that had been bothering him, even admitted he felt nervous about an upcoming work presentation. Rachel felt hopeful. Finally, the emotional intimacy she craved seemed within reach. But what Marcus hadn't anticipated was how exhausting this level of emotional awareness would become. By the 4th day, the mental energy required to constantly monitor and articulate his feelings felt overwhelming. Marcus began to experience what psychologists call ego depletion, the temporary reduction in self-control following exertion of willpower. Without realizing it, he started reverting to familiar patterns of emotional minimization. When Rachel asked how he felt about her mother's upcoming visit, Marcus simply said, "Fine," instead of acknowledging his actual anxiety about the family dynamics. The regression wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was gradual, like watching a photograph fade in sunlight. Each day, Marcus shared slightly less, retreated slightly more, until they were back where they started. Rachel felt confused and hurt. Had she imagined those few days of connection? Was Marcus deliberately pulling away, or was something else happening? What Rachel didn't understand was that Marcus was experiencing what attachment researchers call deactivation strategies, kicking back in. These unconscious mental processes, developed in childhood to manage overwhelming emotions, were reasserting themselves despite Marcus's conscious intentions. It's similar to how Serena van der Woodsen from Gossip Girl would repeatedly promise to change her impulsive behavior, genuinely meaning it each time, only to find herself caught up in the same dramatic patterns weeks later. The second time Marcus promised change, he was even more specific. He would schedule weekly relationship check-ins, where they would discuss any issues before they became problems. This seemed logical, systematic, almost foolproof. Marcus downloaded a calendar app, set reminders, and even researched conversation starters for couples. His planning was meticulous, his motivation high. The first few check-ins went well. Marcus showed up prepared, asked thoughtful questions, and genuinely engaged with Rachel's responses. But what he hadn't accounted for was how these scheduled emotional conversations would begin to feel artificial and forced. His avoidant attachment style craved spontaneity as a way to maintain control over emotional exposure. Having feelings scheduled like dental appointments triggered his unconscious resistance. By the 6th week, Marcus started finding reasons to postpone their check-ins. Work deadlines, social obligations, even minor illnesses became convenient excuses. When they did meet, his participation became increasingly perfunctory. Rachel could sense his discomfort, but couldn't understand why something that had been working was now clearly failing. The pattern revealed a crucial aspect of the planning fallacy as it applies to avoidant individuals. They consistently underestimate not just the time required for change, but the emotional resistance they'll encounter from their own psychological defense systems. It's like planning a road trip without considering traffic, weather, or the need for rest stops. The destination might be clear, but the journey is far more complex than anticipated. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, and where understanding these patterns becomes crucial for anyone dealing with similar situations. Now, if you find yourself in a relationship with someone who keeps making promises they can't keep, the first thing to understand is that frustration is completely natural. Your brain is designed to expect consistency between words and actions, so when someone repeatedly fails to follow through, it creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, a deeply uncomfortable mental state that demands resolution. The key insight is learning to distinguish between genuine commitment to change and what we might call crisis-driven promises. When someone feels threatened by potential loss, their brain floods with stress hormones that create an intense but temporary motivation. This is why the promises often sound so convincing. In that moment, the person genuinely feels capable of anything. But neurological research shows us that this heightened state rarely lasts more than 72 hours. Here's the first practical step. Implement what relationship experts call the cooling off period. When someone makes grand promises of change during an emotionally charged moment, acknowledge their words without immediately accepting them as proof of future behavior. You might say something like, "I appreciate that you want to change, and I'd like to see what that looks like over the next few weeks." This approach protects your emotional energy while giving the other person space to demonstrate consistency. The second crucial element involves understanding the difference between outcome-focused promises and process-focused commitments. When someone says, "I'll be more emotionally available," that's an outcome promise, vague, unmeasurable, and difficult to maintain. A process commitment sounds different. I'm going to read one chapter of this attachment book each week and discuss what I learned with you. Process commitments involve specific, measurable actions that build toward the desired outcome gradually. But here's what makes this particularly challenging with avoidant individuals. They often resist process-focused approaches because these require sustained vulnerability over time. The planning fallacy convinces them they can skip the slow, steady work and jump directly to the end result. It's like believing you can run a marathon without training just because you feel motivated on race day. The third strategy involves what psychologists call implementation intentions. Specific plans that link situational cues to behavioral responses. Instead of relying on willpower alone, this technique leverages the brain's natural pattern recognition abilities. For example, instead of promising to communicate better, someone might commit to, when I feel the urge to withdraw during a conversation, I will take 3 deep breaths and share one thing I'm thinking instead of going silent. This level of specificity matters because it addresses what researchers call the intention-action gap, the space between wanting to do something and actually doing it. Avoidant individuals often have good intentions but lack the concrete strategies needed to bridge this gap consistently. Without these specific plans, they rely on willpower alone, which inevitably fails under stress. Now here's something that might surprise you about helping someone overcome these patterns. The most effective approach often involves reducing pressure rather than increasing it. When avoidant individuals feel monitored or evaluated for their progress, it triggers their fundamental fear of not being good enough, which paradoxically makes them more likely to retreat. This creates what therapists call a performance anxiety loop around relationship improvement. Instead, try what's known as collaborative problem solving. When patterns start to slip, approach the conversation as a team trying to solve a puzzle together rather than as a disappointed partner confronting a failing student. You might say, I noticed we haven't done our weekly check-ins lately. What do you think got in the way? And how can we adjust the approach? This frames setbacks as information rather than failures. The fourth critical insight involves understanding the role of cognitive load in behavioral change. Every new habit or behavior requires mental energy, and avoidant individuals often underestimate how much cognitive resources they're already using to manage their emotional regulation. When they pile multiple changes on top of their existing mental workload, something has to give, and it's usually the newest, least established patterns that disappear first. This is why successful change often requires what therapists call behavioral scaffolding, building one small change at a time and allowing each to become automatic before adding the next. It's less exciting than dramatic transformation, but it's infinitely more sustainable. Think of it like learning to play piano. You don't start with Chopin concertos. You begin with scales and simple melodies. Here's the fifth element that often gets overlooked: the importance of addressing the underlying beliefs that fuel avoidant behavior. Many people focus solely on changing actions while ignoring the thoughts and beliefs that drive those actions. Avoidant individuals often carry deep-seated beliefs like, I'm too much work for people to handle, or relationships always end in disappointment anyway. These beliefs create what psychologists call self-fulfilling prophecies, unconscious behaviors that confirm their fears. Challenging these beliefs requires patience and consistency. When someone shows improvement, acknowledge it specifically rather than generally. Instead of saying, you're doing great, try, I noticed how you stayed present during our difficult conversation yesterday instead of shutting down, and it made me feel much more connected to you. This type of feedback helps rewire the neural pathways that support new behaviors. The sixth strategy involves understanding what researchers call environmental design. Our surroundings and routines have enormous influence over our behavior, often more than willpower alone. If someone wants to be more emotionally present, they might need to create environmental cues that support this goal. Perhaps putting their phone in another room during conversations, or establishing specific physical spaces associated with intimate discussions. Environmental design works because it reduces the need for constant decision-making. When the environment supports desired behaviors automatically, there's less cognitive load and greater likelihood of success. It's like arranging your kitchen to support healthy eating. When nutritious foods are visible and convenient while junk food is hidden away, you're more likely to make better choices without relying solely on willpower. But here's what you need to understand about your own role in this dynamic, and this might be the most important insight of all. When someone repeatedly promises change but doesn't follow through, it's easy to fall into what psychologists call emotional labor escalation. You might find yourself becoming their change manager, reminding them of commitments, tracking their progress, feeling responsible for their success or failure. This dynamic is toxic for both people involved. For you, it creates resentment and exhaustion. For them, it reinforces their unconscious belief that they're incapable of managing their own emotional life. The seventh crucial strategy is learning to maintain what therapists call compassionate detachment, caring about someone's growth while refusing to take responsibility for it. Compassionate detachment might sound like, I support your desire to change, and I'm here to encourage you when you ask for it, but I'm not going to remind you of your commitments or manage your progress. This is something you need to own completely. This approach forces the other person to develop their own internal motivation and accountability systems, which are the only kind that create lasting change. The story of Marcus and Rachel. 6 months later, after Rachel implemented these strategies, something shifted. Marcus realized that his promises had become empty currency, and the pain of that recognition motivated him to seek individual therapy, not couples counseling. Individual work on his own attachment patterns. He stopped making grand promises and started making small, consistent efforts. Some weeks he succeeded, others he didn't. But the difference was that he owned both the successes and the failures completely. Rachel learned to celebrate small improvements without expecting perfection, and she stopped feeling responsible for Marcus's emotional growth. Like Emily Cooper from Emily in Paris, learning to navigate French workplace culture, Rachel had to develop entirely new skills for a situation she'd never encountered before. The relationship didn't transform overnight, but it began moving in a genuinely sustainable direction. Understanding the planning fallacy in avoidant relationships isn't about fixing someone else. It's about protecting your own emotional energy while creating conditions that support genuine growth. Real change happens slowly, quietly, and often without fanfare. It looks like someone choosing to stay present during a difficult conversation instead of finding an excuse to leave. It sounds like someone saying, I'm feeling overwhelmed and need some space, instead of just disappearing for hours without explanation. These small moments of authentic connection are worth more than 1,000 promises of dramatic transformation. The planning fallacy will always make grand gestures seem more appealing than steady progress, but steady progress is what builds relationships that can weather life's inevitable storms. Your heart deserves someone who shows up consistently, not just dramatically. Your energy deserves to be invested in someone who takes responsibility for their own growth, rather than expecting you to manage it for them. And your future deserves to be built on demonstrated patterns of behavior, not hopeful interpretations of promised change. Remember that loving someone doesn't mean accepting empty promises indefinitely. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in patterns that prevent real growth from happening. When you stop enabling the promise relapse cycle, you create space for something genuine to emerge, whether that's authentic change or honest acknowledgement that change isn't happening. The planning fallacy will always whisper that this time is different, that the promises are real, that transformation is just around the corner. But wisdom lies in watching feet, not listening to words, and building your decisions on the foundation of consistent actions rather than the shifting sands of good intentions. Your heart knows the difference, even when your hope tries to convince you otherwise.
Thank you for watching. If you want to learn how to better understand avoidance, relationships, and psychological biases, then subscribe to our channel, because you deserve beautiful relationships.